Welcome everyone to Mishnah in Depth. We are starting a new Masechet today, Mishnah Hullin with Rabbi Walfish. This class is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and sponsored in her memory by her family. It's a pleasure to have so many familiar faces from previous Masechtot, as well as some new faces. Thank you for coming. This class will meet every Sunday following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, where we are assuming that you are learning 1 to 2 mishnayot a week on a day on your own, and we are coming together once a week to review, to investigate, to dig in a bit more. Of course, following the Mishnah Yomit schedule. Our teacher today is Avie Walfish, who is a teacher of Talmud and Jewish thought at Herzog College. He has headed the Master in Education program in Talmud and Jewish thought at Michlala College. He is a graduate of Yeshiva University and a Talmud of Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Soloveitchik, as well as a Musmach of Rabbi Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. We're so glad to have him back at Drisha once again. And the sources are currently up on screen. I'm going to also post them in chat for those who prefer to follow along on their own. And with that, Rabbi Walfish, the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kayla. Okay. So this past week in the Mishnah Yomit program, they actually started the week with concluding Masechet Menachot. So we'll say a word about the conclusion of Masechet Menachot, which will also be a good jumping off point for jumping into Masechet Hullin. Masechet Menachot at the very end concludes with a discussion. This is the one place in the Mishnah where they discuss this. A Beit Mikdash. Now here, this is the Kaufman manuscript text of the Mishnah. It's called Beit Nechunyon. It's better known by the text that you find in printed versions of the Mishnah, Beit Chonyo, or Onias, okay, Greek name. And the Talmud here at the end of Menachot tells a whole story about how there was a rivalry between two brothers for the high priesthood, and there are different versions of the story, but according to each version, one of the brothers ended up fleeing to Egypt and establishing a temple there, known as Beit Chonyo, or here in the manuscript version, Beit Nechunyon. Okay, and it's interesting that the Mishnah relates to it, and the Mishnah's attitude towards it seems to be somewhat ambivalent. Okay, on the one hand, it's not the Beit Hamikdash, and we know there is one Beit Hamikdash, and Mishnah and Masechet Megillah, and at the end of Masechet Zvachim says Yerushalayim ein achareha heter. After the Beit Mikdash was established in Yerushalayim, there is no heter for bamot, and yet there seems to be some kind of tolerance for the idea that there is a mikdash there. It is a mikdash dedicated to God, and it has some degree of legitimacy, and we don't have a time together to try to investigate exactly how this ambivalence plays out, but it was important for me to mention this because Tractate Menachot opens in a way that's very similar to Tractates Zvachim, okay, namely by talking about proper and improper intentions when you bring korbanot mincha, meal offerings, and you have virtually the identical mishnayot in the first chapter or two of Masechet Menachot, virtually identical to the opening chapters of Masechet Zvachim in terms of what it deals with and how they're formulated it. You have to have the intention for the right kind of sacrifice. You have to not have intention to perform part of the sacrifice outside of its appointed place or beyond its appointed time, what's called chutz lizmano v'chutz l'mkomo. Those are the central themes in the early chapters of Masechet Zvachim and in the first chapter or two of Masechet Menachot as well, okay, and almost identical mishnayot coming up. And now, interestingly, the end of Masechet Menachot also echoes a theme that comes at the end of Masechet Zvachim, and that is the centrality of the Beit HaMikdash. The end of Masechet Zvachim, we're told, first of all, about the penalty for offering korbanot outside of the Mikdash, and then the Mishnah at the very end of Zvachim gives a historical survey of different places where Am Yisrael established a place of worship, a central place of worship, starting with Shiloh, okay, and we're starting actually with Gilgal, then on to Shiloh, and then after Shiloh you had Nov and Givon, and then finally we have Yerushalayim, which is the final resting place of the Shekhinah, final resting place of where the temple should be. And even when there's no temple standing, there is no other place, okay, which is fit for sacrificial worship. So that's what concludes Tractates Zvachim. Okay, and here, almost at the very end of Tractate Menachot, we again have this theme of the centrality of the Mikdash, although the attitude here seems to be somewhat more nuanced than at the end of Tractate Zvachim. Again, that's something that have to be thought through, something we don't have time for, but I think it's worth noting that and jotting it down as a point to reflect upon and perhaps study more fully. The second part, which is the actual conclusion. Deborah, you had something you wanted to comment or ask?
How long did Beit Chanyo exist? Do we
I
know?
don't think we know very much about it. That there is a temple in Egypt that we do have some archaeological records of it. That's apparently not Beit Chanyo. Beit Chanyo is later and apparently in a different part of Egypt. Okay, but I don't know too many details about it, and I don't think we know very much about this Beit.
Was it also after Horban Bias or only before?
No, this was during Bayit Sheni. This is all during the period of Bayit Sheni. There is a standing Beit HaMikdash,
Concurrently.
and there is, apparently the Egyptian community felt a need that they couldn't come and worship in the temple in Jerusalem. They felt a need for something closer to home. Okay, now the very end of Masechet Menachot picks up with another theme. Okay, we'll read the very last line here of the Mishnah. Ne'emar ba'olat ha'bema ishei reach nichoach b'mincha ishei reach nichoach. So the olat ha'bema, okay, that's the most impressive offering in the sense that you are taking an entire animal and offering it lock, stock, and barrel to God, okay, burning it all on the Mizbeach, and that's called an Ishei Reach Nichoach, okay, that is a pleasant fragrance for Hashem, okay. These, by the way, are some of the things you have to intend when you bring a sacrifice, according to the end of chapter 4 in Zvachim. You have to intend Reach, and you have to intend Nichoach. You have to intend the fragrance, and you have to intend Nichoach, which Chazal understand to be like Nachat Ruach, okay? The divine satisfaction that you have made this offering. And Bamincha, Korban Mincha is also Reach Nichoach. Now, how much of a Korban Mincha is offered on the Mizbeach. You know exactly how much is offered. Called a kometz.
Kometz.
Okay, now kometz is a minuscule amount, but you can scoop up with 3 fingers up against the palm of your hand. Okay, it's a minuscule amount. That's all that gets offered on the Mizbeach. Lilamed, says the Mishnah, she'echad marbeh ve'echad mima'et, uvivad she'chavein adam et da'ato l'shamayim. Doesn't matter whether you bring a lot or a little, as long as you direct your consciousness to heaven. Okay? In other words, it's the intention that counts. Okay? Now, it's like you say about you give a gift, you give a birthday present, it's the thought that counts. Okay? That's this Mishnah. It's the thought of the sacrifice that counts. As long as you have the appropriate intention, the sacrifice was worthwhile, and the sacrifice achieves the purpose of reach nichoach, a pleasing fragrance, okay, that God will find acceptable, and that gives you an interesting perspective on the connection between Tractates Zvachim and Tractate Menachot on 2 levels. One is just this very idea that you have these 2 sacrifices, one that represents, a great lavish gift, okay, and the other one that represents just giving God a pinch, okay, give him a pinch of flour. That's about it, and yet they have the same value as long as they were given with the proper intention. Okay, so that's one point, and the second point, of course, is the centrality of intention. I already mentioned both Tractates Zvachim and Tractate Menachot open with the idea of what you have to intend when you bring the sacrifice, and also what intentions you have to avoid when you bring the sacrifice. Okay, and so the centrality of intention within the halachic realm of sacrifices is really underscored here at the end of Tractate Menachot. It opens Tractate Zvachim, it opens Tractate Menachot, and it also recurs again at the conclusion of Tractate Menachot. Okay, so that's our siyum on Masechet Menachot, and now we are going to rush on to talk about Masechet Hullin. Okay, now Masechet Hullin, I'm again starting with the assumption that you've all learned the mishnayot on one level or another. You have some basic familiarity with the content, and so, okay, when I say that the topic of Masechet Hullin, most of the tractate, and certainly the early chapters, is slaughtering animals of Hullin. Okay, now Hullin, Hullin by definition is the in a way the antithesis of Kodshim. The Seder we're learning now is Kodshim, Zvachim, Menachot. After Hullin we'll have Bechorot and Arachin, Tmura, Kritut. Okay, all of these are tractates that deal with sacrifices. Hullin, by definition, means unsanctified. Okay, talking about unsanctified animals that are slaughtered not for the sake of worship, but for the sake of consumption, human consumption. Human beings are entitled to slaughter animals in order to consume them. Okay, we just yesterday read Parshat Noach, okay, and in Parshat Noach is where man is granted permission to eat animals. Okay, the simple understanding of the Torah, there's some dispute about this among Mefarshim. The simple reading of the text is that Adam HaRishon and the first 10 generations of man were vegetarian. Okay, they were, okay, you look at the end of Breshit Perek Aleph, what is given to man to eat? Okay, what's given to man to eat are the
grass and tree and fruit.
right. So Esav probably doesn't mean grass; it means produce. Okay,
Okay.
but
What grows from the ground?
right. What grows from the ground and fruits.
Fruits.
Okay, fruits, vegetables, grains. Okay, that's what man is allowed to eat. And in Parshat Noach, when he comes out of the ark, then he's told he is allowed to consume meat. Okay, so we're not going to go. Maybe later on in Masechet Chulin, we will have some occasion to talk about what brought about this permission, why God decided at this point that it should be permitted to consume meat. But whatever the reason might be, okay, that's where we found it in Parshat Noach. Now, as we'll see, for Am Yisrael, that permission was given with certain reservations. Okay, we'll see that presently. Okay, but what Masechet Chulin is going to focus on is the shchita. Okay, and the early chapters in particular focus on the mechanics of shchita. Okay, and later on we'll be talking about other things that impact on the permissibility of eating the animal after shchita. Then Tractate will move on to other ramifications of this. Okay, we're talking about chulin. Okay, for secular, literally for secular purposes, for secular consumption, and that of course raises the question: what is Tractate Chulin doing in Seder Kodshim? Okay, Tractate Chulin, one might imagine, would find a better home somewhere else. Okay, for example, in what other area of the Mishnah do we talk about permitted foods and prohibited foods? Yeah, there's one section of the Mishnah that really is devoted to that, and that is Zra'im. Okay, Zra'im talks about permitted and prohibited foods. Okay, of course, Zra'im talks about permitted and prohibited foods growing from the ground. Okay, in order to be allowed to eat produce that grows from the ground, you have to take trumot and masrot. You have to avoid kilayim. Okay, you have to leave some for the poor, leket shicho peyah. Okay, all kinds of laws of shvi'it. Okay, all of these laws impact on what's permitted and what's prohibited. Challah. Okay, challah already gets you into the kitchen. Okay, so we might imagine that challah is talking about what you bake, so maybe we'll talk about what you roast or cook, okay, which is chulin. Could find room for it somewhere in Seder Zra'im, but no, the Mishnah includes chulin in Seder Kodshim, okay, and that raises some question marks, and I think
perhaps it's related to zvachim.
Okay, so in a certain sense, it's the antithesis of zvachim, but should the antithesis be included? In other words, you include the opposite. Today, much of Am Yisrael is in a spirit of searching for more and more achdut. Okay, not uniformity, but unity. Okay, and unity, of course, means that you don't want to have only one opinion. Okay, you always want to have room for disagreement. Okay, for machloket. So maybe the antithesis tafka belongs there, but I think there's something that goes beyond that. And the first hint of what that might be, we can get from the psukim in the Torah that tell us about the mitzvah of shchita. Shchita is counted as a mitzvah, okay? Not just as a procedure that permits eating, but by and large, authorities regard shchita as a mitzvah. And the source for it is here in Dvarim, chapter 12.
Isn't that
Okay.
pasuk v'achalta v'zavachta? Doesn't it use the same phrase?
V'zavachta v'achalta, that's right. V'zavachta v'achalta is quoted in the Mishnah. You're absolutely correct. The second chapter does quote v'zavachta v'achalta. Okay, so the Mishnah itself refers us back to this passage. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the passage and then see what ideas we can garner from the passage that might give us a better perspective on the relationship between Chulin and Kodshi. Ki archiv Hashem Elokecha et gvulcha ka'asher diber lach, v'amarta ochla basar ki ta'aveh nafshecha lechol basar, v'chol avat nafshecha tochal basar. Okay, when Hashem expands our borders as He promised, and you will then say, "I want to eat meat," because you have a desire to eat meat, then you may eat meat as much as you desire. Okay. Ki yirchak mimcha makom asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha lasum shemo sham. And here's the key pasuk. This is the pasuk that Deborah quoted earlier. V'zavachta mi bekarcha u'mitzoncha asher natan Hashem lecha kasher tziviticha v'achalta b'sharecha b'chol avat nafshecha. Okay, because the place that Hashem chose to place His name, okay, will be far, will be distant. Okay, therefore, v'zavachta. Now, what does v'zavachta mean? We usually translate v'zavachta like zvachim, right? Sacrifices. But actually, the word, by the way, also the word mizbeach, right? Mizbeach is the place on which you bring a zevach, right? A zevach is a sacrifice. The mizbeach is the place where you bring the sacrifice. But v'zavachta here can't mean sacrifice because you're not taking it to the temple. V'zavachta here means just to slaughter. Okay, the word lizboach has two meanings. It has the meaning, the generic meaning of to slaughter, and the more specific meaning of to slaughter an animal sacrifice. Here, it's having the broader meaning, the one that does not automatically mean sacrifice. Okay, and by the way, linguistically, the word zevach is related etymologically to tet bet chet. We're unfortunately familiar with that word in recent years from
Evach.
the massacre on October 7th on Simchat Torah, which in Israel we call the Tevach. Okay, but also the word tabach, which literally means a butcher, in contemporary Hebrew somehow came to mean a cook. The mitbach becomes the place where you prepare any kind of food. Okay, but initially, litboach means also to slaughter. Okay,
Sar hatabachim.
Sar hatabachim, okay, is the chief butcher. It's not altogether clear. He was the butcher of animals or of human beings. Okay, but be that as it may, that's the word litboach, and zayin and tet are letters that are sometimes interchangeable. Okay, so v'zavachta is like v'tavachta. It's the slaughter. You shall slaughter, okay, kasher tziviticha, as I commanded you, and this, of course, immediately raises a question. Slaughter as I commanded you. When did God command us to slaughter an animal in order to eat it? We don't have any prior mention of this. So kasher tziviticha is a rather, guys, is a rather puzzling formulation. Ramban relates to this question, and he says, if you look in the second line of Ramban, okay, Ramban is the third source here. You look in the second line, middle of the line, kasher tziviticha biotam korbanot, v'tochal otam chulin b'chol ta'avat nafshecha. Ramban says that's the whole point of the pasuk. V'zavachta kasher tziviticha. Take the same procedure that you are used to applying to korbanot where you have been commanded. Okay? Regarding the korbanot, the usual term, of course, is shchita. Okay? The Torah says about every one of the animal korbanot that we have to shochet the korban. That's how it has to be slaughtered, through shchita. Right? And so, kasher tziviticha, Ramban says, is a throwback to the korbanot. Now let's get a bit more of a perspective on what context this passage appears, in which context it appears. The context is most of Parshat Re'eh, where this passage appears, is about the Beit HaMikdash and the centrality of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, the Beit HaMikdash is the only place where we can bring sacrifices, and any sanctified items that we have to be brought to the Beit HaMikdash. And in that framework, the Torah then says, but since you're going to be living in far-flung places, you can be living in Eilat, or you can be living in Metula, okay? And then you want to eat meat, so it's not realistic to say you want to eat meat, okay? So travel to Yerushalayim and offer a sacrifice in the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, instead, the Torah provides for eating meat right where you are. However, says the Torah, and here's where the Ramban kicks in to this. Here's where kasher tziviticha kicks in, and I think the Ramban's reading, to my mind, is a very cogent reading. He says, kasher tziviticha, treat it like a sacrifice. Not in the sense that it becomes a sanctified animal, because tochal otam chulin b'chol tavat nafshecha. Eat it as you please. Okay? It's chulin, it's yours. Okay? Prepare it as you like, eat it as you like. No restrictions on where, when, how, as you like. Okay? However, when you slaughter the animal the same way that you would be doing if it were a sacrifice. And that in turn, okay, explains the use of this unusual term, v'zavachta, instead of v'shachateta. And let's move up to a midrashic source, a source from the period of Chazal, from the Tanaitic period, Midrash Tanaim, to this to these psukim. V'zavachta ma kodashim b'shchita v'chulin b'shchita. Just as kodshim you slaughter by doing shchita, by slitting the neck, so chulin as well has to be done b'shchita. So then the midrash asks, ima kodshim b'makom av chulin b'makom. So maybe you have to bring chulin to the place as well. In other words, to the mikdash, to the sanctuary. Talmud Amar ki yirchak mimcha makom v'zavachta b'richuk makom. Okay, now part of the backdrop to this is that in Vayikra chapter 17, okay, Parshat Achrei Mot, we have a passage that says that, and this again, there's a dispute how exactly to read this passage. Okay, goes back to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, and then carries on among Mefarshim, Rashi, and Ramban. Okay, but I think the simple reading is to say that chapter 17 says, when Am Yisrael were in the wilderness, if they wanted to eat meat, they had to bring it as a sacrifice. Why? The answer is in our passage. Because it's a hop, skip, and a jump. Okay?
Because they weren't far.
You have a camp whose entire perimeter is like 12 kilometers wide in either direction. Okay? So you're never more than 6 kilometers away from the Mishkan. You want to eat meat, bring it to the Mishkan, bring it as a sacrifice. If you bring it as a sacrifice, you can eat most of the meat. Part of it you'll have to give to the Kohen, but anyway, parts of Hullin have to be given to the Kohen as well. We'll learn about that later on in Masechet Hullin. Okay? A small part of it will have to be offered on the Mizbeach. So God gets his part. That's the midrashic explanation of the name of the Korban, Shlamim. Shlamim means everybody is at peace with everybody else because everybody gets a piece of the action. God gets his part, the Kohen gets his part, the one who brought the Korban gets his part. Everyone benefits from it. And that's the only way that you can eat meat when you're in the sanctuary. Now, that itself might impact on the question that I told you I'm shelving for now, the question of how tolerant the Torah is of the desire to eat meat. There's like the Torah basically vegetarian, but made some kind of concession to human nature and said, okay, you want to eat meat, go ahead, eat meat. Or does the Torah have a more neutral attitude towards eating meat? It's perfectly okay to eat meat. That's part of man's prerogative. Man is given dominion over nature, and that includes dominion over animals, including the right to eat them. So the fact that Am Yisrael, while they were in the wilderness, could eat meat only in the form of a sacrifice might give us, and might incline us in the direction of saying the Torah isn't entirely happy about eating meat. That's what the Torah says. If it's within the framework of an offering to God, okay, we can tolerate that. If you just want to do it for your own benefit, we're not so happy about that. So you can't do that. But then comes Dvarim chapter 12 and says, that's all fine and good when Am Yisrael are living in their parents' house. Okay? So when they're eating at their parents' house, they want to eat meat. So they can't do it in their bedroom. They have to do it in the central dining area. Okay? So God says, this is your central dining area if you want to eat meat. You want to eat meat? Bring it here. Bring it to my temple. Give me a piece of it. Give the Kohen a piece of it. Then you can eat meat. Otherwise, forget it. You're not entitled to eat meat. But then Am Yisrael come to the land, and now we've moved out of the house. We've set up our own house. We're living far away. And so God says, okay, you can't bring every piece of meat to the temple in order to eat it. Okay, but, and so I'm going to allow you to eat meat in your own homes, okay, without turning it into a sacrifice. But what both the Midrash and Ramban tell us is, but retain some of the trappings of a sacrificial offering, and most particularly shchita. Okay? You should slaughter it the same way you slaughter sacrifices. And maybe in some sense, it becomes a kind of quasi-sacrificial procedure. It's not a sacrificial procedure. There may be a kind of quasi-sacrificial procedure, and it's worth remembering in this connection a midrash, I'm guessing most or maybe all of you have heard on one occasion or another, okay, that after the destruction of the temple, so what takes the place of the temple for for Jews after that point is his dinner table. Okay, there are all kinds of minhagim that grow out of that. Maybe netilat yadayim is related to that. Okay, having to wash before a meal. Dipping your bread in salt is related to that because sacrifices had to be salted. Okay, there's a custom to remove sharp knives from the table before reciting Birkat HaMazon, the same way that iron implements were not supposed to be used on the Mizbeach. Okay, so there are various expressions to this idea, okay, that we conduct a meal in a certain sense, okay, we do things that are reminiscent of sacrificial services. And maybe part of that, maybe even a central part of that is that the meat that we have has to be slaughtered the same way that sacrifices were slaughtered. Okay.
Question, Rabbi, is
Yes.
with other food groups, there's commanded ways that we have to share our crops. And is maybe part of it that this is a food group or where there's no other natural way to share it. So we have these unusual commands about how to bring it and sacrifice it in order to kind of replicate, we have a sort of giving of a portion back to others.
Okay, well, actually, there are portions of the Hullin meat that will be given to the Kohen. We'll learn about them later on in the tractate. But I don't think it's just a question of sharing with others. Okay, with the crops as well. Okay, if you go through the different halachot within a tractate within Seder Zra'im, then you'll see that part of it has to do with the society. Okay, that I don't take all of the crops for myself, but I share it with others, with the poor, with the Kohanim, with the Leviim, and so on. But part of it is, and the Torah already said this, part of it is the land is not ours. We have to recognize that, okay, we're giving some to God. In the case of the crops, by and large, what you give to God, God then says, well, give it to my servants, give it to the Kohanim, or give it to the poor. Okay? But in a sense, we're offering it to God, and God is then passing it on to different segments of the society. So there as well, you have these two themes that sometimes one is dominant, sometimes the other is dominant, and often they're working together. Okay, the kind of interplay between the two of them. Okay, in the case of Hullin, I think the theological component is more dominant. Okay, the social component seems to be less prominent, although not absent. It's there. Okay, but I think it pretty much takes a back seat to the theological, the worshipful component of it. Okay, now okay, I have here the text of the Mishnah. We're not going to read through the whole thing. As I say, I'm proceeding on the assumption that you've gone through a lot of the material. Okay, and the first thing I'd like to do is just a kind of introduction to the halachic content of a good part of these two chapters. Okay, now these halachot come mostly from chapter 2. One of them comes from chapter 1, but this is how the Talmud itself summarizes the basic laws of shchita that emerge from these first two chapters. Okay, and Chazal break it down into 5 different principles that govern how shchita needs to be accomplished. Okay, and as Chazal so often do, they formulate it in the negative. Okay, what is an improper shchita? So there are 5 things you can do to ruin the shchita. Okay, and those are Shehiyah, Drasa, Chalada, Hagrama, and Ikur. Okay, and now let's just briefly survey the mishnayot that present these ideas. Okay, so the idea of drasa. Okay, drasa. Drasa means now. Let's just I'm afraid the people who are squeamish are not going to enjoy Hullin very much. Okay, so I apologize in advance, but that's the material. Okay, so the basic idea of shchita is you have to slit the neck of the animal. The slitting the neck of the animal, as the Mishnah makes very clear at the beginning of chapter 2. Okay, the two main parts, okay, that's the esophagus and the trachea, okay, and the two of them have to be sliced through. Okay, now shchita is a slicing motion, okay, and classically it's done, okay, with a double motion, okay, holacha v'hava'ah, okay, so you draw the knife towards you and then pull it back, okay, you pull the knife towards you and then push it back, okay, and in that motion you're supposed to slice through, okay, the trachea and the esophagus. Okay, now drasa means if you apply too much pressure, so it's not a slicing motion. Okay, I mean we all know that from cutting. Okay, you take the knife, okay, and if you slice it, you're pulling the knife along and pressing down gently so that as you pull it along, it also slices through, okay? Or sometimes you slice by just taking the knife, putting it on top of there, and pushing it down. That's drasa, okay? And the Mishnah expresses that in Perek Bet Mishnah Gimel, in the halacha that he tizet harosh bevat achat psula. If I take one motion, not a back and forth motion, a single motion, a back without a forth, okay, okay, and it cuts through, it severs the head, that's a sign I'm pushing too hard.
You
I'm
press.
not slicing, I'm pushing. That's called drasa. That's one thing that can undermine the shchita.
That's applying too much pressure.
That's applying too much pressure. Okay, shehiyah. Shehiyah means tarrying, waiting. Okay, so that same Mishnah that we just quoted now, that same Mishnah also says, Nafla sakin v'higbiha. Okay, I'm doing the shchita, and oops, the knife falls down. Okay, and then I stoop down, pick up the knife, and I take too long in picking up the knife and resuming the shchita. Im shahah kedei shchita achat psula. I don't know how long a shchita is supposed to take. Let's say 20 seconds. So if it takes me 20 seconds to pick up the knife and resume the shchita, no good. Okay, no, there has to be a continuous action. Continuous doesn't mean without any interruption, but if there is an interruption, it has to be brief. And the definition of brief is long enough for a shchita to take place. Chalada, that's the third. Okay, so now we're talking about a shochet who's apparently very dexterous, and therefore he slices through one of the simanim, okay, the two pipes, okay, the esophagus and trachea. He slices through one of them, and then instead of slicing through the other one from the outside, he takes the knife and puts it on the inside, and then cuts through from that side. Okay, notice instead of slicing through from the outside of the neck going in, okay, one of the two pipes, he cuts through from the inside. Okay, that's called chalada. Hagrama, hashoche, okay, that's the Mishnah following the one we've been looking at. Okay, coming back to chapter 1, Perek Aleph Mishnah Gimel, we have Hagrama, which is Hashochet mitoch hatabaat. Okay, now the tabaat is the neck area. Okay, so there's the part of the two pipes, okay, the food pipe and the windpipe, that are inside the neck. And that's called the tabaat. Okay, Hashochet mitoch hatabaat. Actually, let me revise that. The tabaat, it's composed of tabaot. Okay, the pipes, okay, are not all one smooth area. Okay, it's like different pieces, okay, that are attached to one another. So he does it, let's say, at the top, the very, very top of the neck, and he's slicing through the top section of the appropriate pipe. The shiur ba melo hachuta pnei chula, if he leaves a hair's breadth, literally a thread's breadth, okay, along the entire width of the pipe, then shchita tokshera. Okay, which is another way of saying, if at any point I'm slicing too high, at the point where there isn't even a hair's breadth left of that pipe, okay, so I'm slicing too high, and that's called hagrama. Okay, so hagrama means that part of the shchita was out of the zone. There's a shchita zone. I have to stay within it. If I get up to the edge but not quite at the edge, I'm okay. If I get all the way up to the edge, that disqualifies the shchita. And finally, ikur, shachatet haveshet ufasaket hagargeret, or shachatet hagargeret ufasaket haveshet. Okay, we're back to Perek Bet Mishnah Dalid. Okay, and ikur means to like tear it out. Okay, instead of cutting through the pipe, I uproot the pipe. Ikur is to uproot. So I uproot the pipe. So if I sliced through one and uprooted the other, that's also pasul. Okay? So that's like the main halachic content of these chapters. But, okay, so if we were learning Hilchot Shchita, we would be focused on about 3 mishnayot from these 2 chapters. Okay? Which tells us right away that the Mishnah has other fish to fry. Okay, if you don't mind mixing meat and fish. Okay,
Can I ask you a question?
yeah,
Of the 5 of them, the only one where it says that it's okay is number 4. It just doesn't seem to follow the same,
that's right.
Right?
Right. The other 4
Are
tells you
totally
the case where
wrong,
it's
are
no
always
good.
wrong. Right.
Okay, and this one tells you the case where it is good, and you figure out which one isn't good. Both of those are, styles that the Mishnah employs. Okay, it's hard to figure out why it'll employ this style or that style, and whether that's significant. Okay, so it's a point, but not one that I think we can profitably pursue. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the other things that are going on, because I think the deeper message of these 2 chapters is going to take us back to the point with which we began. And that's what I have here on this chart. Okay, this chart, you see Zvachim and Chulin. Okay, And as we go through several of the mishnayot in these two chapters, okay, about halfway through the first chapter, okay, and about the first half of the first chapter and the second half of the second chapter, we'll see that there are a lot of parallels to Tractate Hullin. And what do these parallels tell us? So let's start off with the first parallel, the very first Mishnah in Tractate Hullin. Hakol shochatin ushchitatan kshera, chutz mechere shotev v'katan shema yikalkalu b'shchitatan. Okay, now the Mishnah tells us anyone can do shchita, except for people who are mentally deficient. Okay, that includes ktanim, who obviously could have very high IQs, but they don't have good judgment. Okay, they're too young to be considered to be mentally proficient. Okay, and the others are mentally deficient for one reason or another. Those are the only ones, and the only reason they can't do shchita is because we don't trust them to do it right. Shama yikalkalu b'shchitatan. Okay, in other words, the important thing about shchita, we can see right off the bat, is not what you are intending. Remember, Tractate Menachot brought us back to the theme of intention, how central intention was within the framework of sacrifices. Well, Tractate Hullin opens by telling us you don't really have to have very much intention at all. Even a cheresh shotev katan, the Mishnah goes on to say, I didn't bring it here, but if you look at the text of Mishnah 1, that if someone observes their shchita, it's okay. Okay? So shchita just has to be done technically, in a technically proficient way. That's all. Okay? Zvachim, interestingly, shchita also can be done virtually by anyone. People who are pasul to do the service in the temple can do shchita. Shashchita kshera, bizarim, binashim, bavadim, bitmeim. All the people who can't serve, they can do shchita. So already in Zvachim, we see that shchita, in certain senses, is considered to be an avodah. It's considered to be a part of the service, part of the sacrificial service, but it's really a preliminary part of the sacrificial service. And therefore, it doesn't have to be done by Kohanim. However, in Hullin, this idea is stressed much more. Hakol shochatin. Ula olam shochatin. You can do the shchita at any time, day, night, any hour. Uva kol shochatin. You can do shchita with any kind of implement. Now, the main theme in Zvachim, even though a lot of these laws don't apply to shchita per se, Masechet Zvachim is much more focused on the limitations as to who can do things, where you can do things, when you can do things, with what can you do things, right? And I just brought one example of that from chapter 2 of Zvachim, which is talking about Kol Zvachim Shekibel Daman. It's the receiving of the blood. Is there any need for receiving the blood when it comes to Chulin? Presumably not, although
No, it just has to
to
go
that
out.
point in just a bit. We'll get to that point. Okay, there's a surprise here. The short answer is no. There is no need for receiving the blood when it comes to Chulin. In the passage in Dvarim that we read earlier, it says, "Don't eat the blood. Al haaretz tishbechenu kamayim. Pour it out on the ground like water." Okay, no, there's no need to do anything with it. Sacrificial blood, you have to receive, you have to place on the altar. But Chulin blood, let it pour on the ground. You don't have to worry. Don't worry about it. Okay, but as I said, the Mishnah has a surprise in store for us in this way. Now, there are all kinds of other parallels. Hullin continues to talk about how shchita has to be done from the neck. And then the Mishnah contrasts that with milika, which is done for sacrificial birds. Okay, birds of Hullin are also slaughtered. That's the first Mishnah in chapter 2. But sacrificial birds, okay, you have to cut through the neck with a fingernail, okay, with a thumbnail, right? Okay, and it's done from the back. And so the Mishnah says, what works for shchita is the neck. What works for malika is the back of the neck. Okay, so that of course harks back to Zvachim, which also made some similar points. Okay, and then interestingly, the first chapter of Hullin has a digression which we won't have time to investigate today. Bezrat Hashem will. Okay, since we have several weeks together, so I'm going to use each shiur to catch up on the most important points I wasn't able to get to the first time. Okay. Okay, so the second part of Hullin chapter 1, okay, digresses and gives you a survey of different areas of halacha, opening with something that again harks back to Zvachim, that about Torim and Bnei Yonah, okay, which are, okay, what are their laws regarding sacrifice? Well, let's continue now. So we've seen several parallels. Let's note what's the main theme of these parallels. That Hullin is a much more liberal area of halacha than Zvachim. Zvachim is a very highly structured, ceremonial area of halacha. Okay, other than the shchita, which has a certain degree of freedom, but shchita also has to be done in a particular place. When you're talking about Zvachim, it has to be inside the temple. Some of them have to be even in a certain part of the courtyard of the temple. And other parts of the sacrificial proceeding have very, very specific halachot. Who can do it, where, when, how, with what. And Hullin, shchitat Hullin is much more open-ended. That's the main point that emerges from these comparisons. But at the end of chapter 2, we have some comparisons that move in a different direction. Okay, that fits the pattern. Okay, if blood doesn't come out, that's fine. If blood didn't come out of a sacrifice, can't do anything, because you have to put the blood on the mizbeach. That's crucial. With Hullin, it's not. But then we have a later Mishnah that says, Osehu Adan. Adan is like Adam, okay, a person can make a pit in his house, okay, in order to gather the blood. So we already saw you don't have to gather the blood. What if you want to gather the blood? Okay, I don't want the blood all over my house. I want it to be some kind of a drain that the blood will flow into. So I make a drain on the floor of my house. Remember, they had dirt floors. Okay, so I make a drain and I want the blood to drain off into that. That's okay. Okay. Why would I think otherwise? Okay, because the Mishnah right next to that said that if I do it on a shift, then that could be a problem. Okay, why might it be a problem? So look at the context. The context is that the Mishnah, already in 2:7 and going into 2:8 and continuing into 2:10, talks about, what if I slaughter the animal with the intention of avodah zarah? It starts with, what if I slaughter the animal on behalf of a non-Jew? So the majority opinion is that's okay. But Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's not okay, because probably the non-Jew intends it to be idolatrous. So you are collaborating in an idolatrous slaughtering. Okay, so we have a dispute about that, but then the Mishnah goes on to talk about, well, is it really so terrible that he intends it? I'm doing the slaughtering. Doesn't it all depend on what I intend? That's exactly what the Mishnah says. And when the Mishnah says that, it again echoes Zvachim. In Zvachim, we have, if I slaughter with the improper intent, that ruins the sacrifice. And at the end of chapter 4, the Mishnah discusses whose intent. Let's say the Kohen does the service with the right intent, but the person who brought the korban has the wrong intent. Will that also ruin the korban? So there's an opinion cited there, Eina machshava olechet el alachar haoved. Okay, machshava is only the one who actually does the service, not the one on behalf of whom the service is done. And this Mishnah is actually quoted here in Hullin chapter 2. Okay, in rejecting Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that if you slaughter on behalf of a non-Jew, it's a problem because he probably intended idolatry, the pushback is, so he intended it, but I'm the one who did the slaughtering. And just as regarding sacrifices, the intention follows the one who does the action and not the one on behalf of whom it's done. I'll say the same thing regarding Hullin as well. So what do I see at the end of chapter 2? I see that intention can be an issue for Hullin as well. But again, there's a difference. Regarding Zvachim, the intention that ruins it is the intention for the sacrifice not to be conducted in the proper fashion. In order to render the Hullin an improper slaughtering, there's only one kind of intention that will render it an improper slaughtering, and that is for idolatry. In other words, I don't have to slaughter it on behalf of God. That's sacrifices. Sacrifices I have to have in mind, I am doing this for God's greater glory. I am worshiping God by bringing this sacrifice. That has to be in my mind when I bring the sacrifice. And when I have intentions that undermine the meaning of the sacrifice, that undermines the validity of the sacrifice. Regarding slaughtering Hullin, I don't have to intend it for something positive, but I do very much have to avoid intending it for idolatry. And in Mishnah 10, it can even be a problem if I intend it to be a sacrifice. If it is Hullin and I'm slaughtering it outside of the Mikdash, then maybe if I intend it as a sacrifice, that will also undermine its validity. Okay, so what I've tried to show here is that the Mishnah itself seems to be, in strategic points in these two chapters, conducting a dialogue with Tractates Zvachim. Okay, and comparing and contrasting Hullin with Kodshim. Okay, telling us on one level, Shchitav Chulin this is not kodshim. This is not sacrifices. It's a much different area. It's much more open, much more liberal. Okay, we have much fewer standards and demands here than we do in Tractates Vachim. On the other hand, some of the things that we had in Tractates Vachim have parallels in Tractate Chulin as well. Some of the things in Tractate Chulin are designed to remind us, yes, this is Chulin, this is for you, but remember, God is somehow in the background here. Okay? We want to make this something sanctified, not sanctified on the level of sacrifices, but something that will sanctify our consumption of Chulin. Okay, we'll conclude with that for today. As I say, we have a couple of points from the first two chapters that I will, Bezrat Hashem, make up next week, and we'll continue with the next couple of chapters next week. Erev Tov, Shavua Tov.
Thank you, everyone. And just one programming note, if you are joining us from Israel, the US is switching over to winter time next Motzei Shabbos. So this class will meet at the normal 7 hour time difference as opposed to this week's. And with that, take care, everyone.